Thank you. As Sam said, I've been working on this, I think it's fair to say, on and off for a little while now. Really focused down in the last 18 months or so. I've really only put this initial slide up because it always amuses me to see the phrase, the virtue coach, next to my name. But it seems to have been it's a pithy phrase to describe what I'm attempting to do, and also seems to have resonated with a few. And I was saying to Mark yesterday, I often find with this type of presentation is that I get an idea down fairly early on, and then I will tinker with it up until the last minute. And this next slide that I'm going to go on to is a good example of that. So you will see there a reading from the Book of Wisdom. And I'm just going to read it out. I do occasionally read things out from slides, unlike some of our esteemed speakers. But because it's actually quite powerful when you read it. The souls of the virtuous are in the hands of God. No torment shall ever touch them. In the eyes of the unwise they did appear to die. Their going looked like a disaster. Their leaving us like annihilation. But they are at peace. If they experienced punishment as men see it, their hope was rich with immortality. Slight was their affliction, great will their blessings be. God has put them to the test and proved them worthy to be with him. He has tested them like gold in a furnace and accepted them as a holocaust. When the time comes for his visitation, they will shine out. As sparks run through the stubble, so will they. They shall judge nations, rule over peoples, and the Lord will be their king forever. They who trust in him will understand the truth. Those who are faithful will live with him in love, for grace and mercy await those he has chosen. And there's a lot in that. But the reason I picked it, I was very struck with something, I think it was Catherine said yesterday, that we, as a society, no longer want to talk about death. We don't want to accept that suffering is basically inevitable. And it's really interesting that as a society, our main discussion about death tends to be to alleviate suffering, so we'll kill people. But when it comes to death itself, we want to avoid it. If we look, without wanting to get into a debate about the rights and wrongs of how we responded to COVID, the entire discussion was about how do we avoid the spread of it, the suffering it might create, the death, at the expense of anything else. And I think that has led us to a place. In that reading, you get a real sense of we all die. How are we going to live to get there? And I think that avoidance of death, that avoidance of the language of suffering, directs us away from what our ultimate goal is in society. Our culture, maybe I'm looking at this through rose-tinted glasses, I don't know, I didn't live in previous times, but my sense is that previously the culture helped people to remember that ultimately our aim was heaven. You know, at some level, Christianity infused where we were at in a way that it doesn't now. So it directs us away from our ultimate goal. And so a lot of my thesis for today is the idea that we need to reclaim that. And one of the most essential ways of doing so is to identify mission, our own individual sense of mission and purpose. And I'll go into what that means as we go through this. And virtue is the way that we achieve it. It's amazing. I've worked with quite a few people in the last couple of years who are looking at some of this with me. It's amazing the number, and it's men in particular that I work with, a couple of women, but mainly men, the number who are in a good situation. You know, they know what, they've got the vocation, they're married, they've got kids, they want to do that well. You know, they'll be going to mass regularly, you know, they pray, and all of this, and yet they've just got this sense that they're not quite sure what the direction needs to be. And I think mission will really help with that. It's really interesting. You look in society, you will often come across people who you look at and you've clearly got something going on. You're directed in a particular way, but it's almost like this Dragon's Den culture. It's all around money. It's all around that external success and what I guess society might perceive that our direction should be, in the absence of the idea that ultimately we're aiming for heaven. But when you do get someone who has both a clear mission and direction and is virtuous with it, it just shines out like a light. We've heard Mother Teresa talked about a lot, but you look at her and she's got this clear sense of mission, and yet as much as Christopher Hitchens of his world might want to say otherwise, is just the most virtuous and obviously virtuous person. And it stands out like a light. At the risk of embarrassing him, I was quite taken with Mark at the Q&A last night when he was talking about the bishops, inevitably. But there was that real sense of passion. When he talked about, he said, I'm putting my family on the line for this. How dare they ignore it, almost? I think that was right. I'm not misquoting you there, am I? There we go. Somebody didn't like it. But there was a real sense of mission on that. It was this sense of this must be done, and this must be done by me. And I think we can learn from that, bluntly. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about virtue. I'm going to focus primarily on the virtues of magnanimity and humility, and I hope the reasons for that will become clear as I talk. I'll touch briefly on some of the cardinal virtues. And then I'm going to talk at the end about mission, what it might look like for each of us, and how it relates to vocation, because they're not the same thing. So, what is virtue? It's an interesting question. It's quite important to understand it, I think, if we're going to say we want to go for it. And Sam touched on it earlier, actually, a large chunk of it. So we've got a variety of different people, which I'm going to put up on the screen, who have said various things about it. So Plato, virtue is a kind of health, beauty, and good habit of the soul. That's not a disastrous description. It's not quite as specific as I'd like to get to, but it's a good idea of what it looks like. We then have Aristotle, and this is what Sam was referring to earlier. Virtue is the golden mean between two vices, the one of excess and the other of deficiency. So it's this idea that there's this golden strand which flows through every action we might take, and it's hitting that bit in the middle which serves us well. We then move on to Aquinas. Happiness is secured through virtue. It's a good attained by man's own will. And that's really important. That last bit, it is a good attained by man's own will. There's been a lot of talk at this conference, and I think it's great, about the fact that as men we are called to action. This is not just going to happen because we know about it. We need to do things. Our will needs to be in line with this, and then we need to act on our will. This is not just going to come by virtue of our desire. And that's really important to remember. We next have, actually I'm going to skip over that because I'm going to talk about that a bit later. We have, as Sam talked about Alex a minute ago, virtues are qualities of the mind, the will and the heart that instill strength of character and stability of personality. They are acquired through repetition. And I'll touch on that as we talk about the different virtues. And then finally, inevitably, the world always goes to Google today, so it's worth knowing what it says. It's behaviour showing high moral standards, a quality considered morally good or desirable in a person, or a good or useful quality of a thing. None of which is wrong in itself, but I think is a little more, the second one in particular, a little more relativistic than I would perhaps say is correct. And I think we see that in when we hear society talk about what is virtuous today. It's not in line, I would say, with some of what we might consider to be so. So, the next slide. What is the pursuit of virtue? And you see in Matthew chapter 5, verse 48, you therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And this is in the context, it comes immediately after our Lord talking about the idea of forgiveness of enemies, prayer for your enemies. This idea of mercy with justice. Actually, everybody is nice to their friends. Everybody is good to the people we like. So we need to be more than that. You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And in the context of what we as individuals can do, the pursuit of virtue is the quest to be perfectly human. The recognition that personal excellence is a duty. The thing that really convinced me that this was real, as opposed to just a nice phrase, actually, it was chatting to Alex a few years ago, and he talked about the fact that, he's a sought-after speaker, he gets people approaching him on a regular basis, and he talked about the number of people he has worked with who liked the idea of virtue, were completely atheist. They came along, they wanted to know about courage, about what it was to be just, but were very, very clear with Alex when they approached him that they had no interest in anything beyond that. They didn't want to know about the spiritual aspects, etc. And what he said was that as they started to learn more and put the practice of virtue into their lives, they started to become more Christ-like. They started to move towards Christ without even meaning to. And eventually, he said he's lost count of the number of conversions that have occurred just through that. That was the starting point, because they started to want to be more perfect. And I think it's worth bearing in mind, we can do a lot. Christ was perfectly human, and we are called to be like Christ. And virtue is the means we have to get there. So, I want to talk briefly about something called Aretology, the science of virtue. So we have a quote here from Pope St. John Paul II. The Aristotelian system of virtues is clearly based upon a genuine anthropology. This system, on which the self-realization of human freedom in truth depends, can be described as exhaustive. It is not abstract or an a priori system. It isn't just there. And so this idea of the science of virtue is essentially founded by classical Greek philosophers, but as I've already spoken about with Aquinas in particular, but Christianity built on it. It recognized the truth in it, but applied it in Christian terms. And it really comprises of two kinds of virtues. You have the intellectual virtues, which are related to human knowledge, and ethical virtues related to human behaviour. These intellectual virtues help us to grasp reality, while the ethical ones help us act in accordance with human nature. Just as an aside, Prudence has both of these qualities. It's both intellectual in as much as it involves knowledge, and it's ethical in as much as it ensures that that knowledge is directed towards decision and action. These ethical virtues are also called human virtues or natural virtues, or as from the 4th century, Ambrose of Milan called them the cardinal virtues. And cardinal, for the purposes here, just means hinges. It's the ones on which all other virtues depend. And you'll see here in the tables, we've got, in essence, a kind of it'll be on your right actually, my left. No, sorry, your left, my right. It's almost like it's not quite a pyramid in the description, but you start off at fundamental humility, you know oneself. You then go through the various growth in the 4 cardinal virtues, and then come to the idea of greatness and service, magnanimity and humility, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail in a minute. On the other side, you've got what is broadly the same diagram, albeit presented slightly differently as Sam had this morning, about the humility is the middle ground between pride and I can never say this word, so I'm going to tell you what it means instead. Between pride and what is essentially a small-mindedness, a false modesty. I'm not very keen on modesty, and particularly not when it's false. And I'll explain why when we get onto humility. We have self-mastery, which is the golden mean between harshness and intemperance. But it's really worth understanding this. I think one of the problems we often have with pursuing virtue is we think it's good enough just to act. We don't need to know very much. But actually the problem with that is we then don't really know what we're aiming at. We don't know the particular thing that we're trying to act on. And so eventually we go wrong. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about magnanimity. And Aristotle was really the first writer to talk about this. And these things here are me basically paraphrasing. But Aristotle talked about the magnanimous person as being someone who practices virtue and therefore considered himself worthy of great things, and by which at that time it meant honour. But he doesn't need those honours because he practices virtue, which is the greatest of treasures. And I think that last point is very important here. Virtue is its own reward. And it's worth remembering. But St. Thomas Aquinas moved that on and shifted it. He would talk about this insatiable appetite for great things. He described it as magnitude animi. I might be mispronouncing that. And animi is this idea of action, an almost warrior-like action. And as I've already said, we've heard so much about masculinity as action and femininity as passivity. And I would posit that magnanimity is the masculine virtue par excellence. It is designed to make us act. It is a deliberate development of magnanimity in our soul will get us to act and act as men and act well. But he also said it's not that we are worthy of great things, but we are worthy of doing great things. And he understood that as coming from Christ's sacrifice for us. We are now worthy of achieving great things, but we are not in and of ourselves worthy. And that shifts it on, because all of a sudden we start to look at the idea of service as opposed to this being about me being great. And it's a really, really important distinction to keep in mind. So a few of the characteristics of magnanimity. The magnanimous person is mindful of their own personal dignity. They do nothing that is going to contradict that. Or they try to. I'm sure we've all got examples from our own lives of where we fall short of that. I certainly have, at numerous times. But they will not overtly go out of their way to, they are protective of their personal dignity in whatever that is dictated by in particular circumstances. They will also affirm their own dignity. The magnanimous person is clear about their strengths and talents. They are active about going out and finding what they are. But they also embrace them. It's really fascinating. If you work in the civil service for a while, as I do, or have done, there's a lot of emphasis on, okay, development. What we need to do is focus over here on the things you're not so good at and get you up to speed. And I've stopped doing that. the focus needs to be, what is your strength? Where are your talents? Make those outstanding, because that is where you're going to make your difference. Doesn't matter how bad you are at this, that's never going to be the thing where you impact the world. There might need to be a certain level you need to get to, I guess, but that is not going to be the thing where you impact the world. The thing where you will make a difference, the thing where you will be able to be magnanimous, where you will be able to be the person who is attractive to all those people around you, is because you've embraced what you're really good at. And I guarantee there is something that each of you is really good at. Now, whether you know it or not is another question, but there is. And finally, explore dreams and visions and pursue your mission. I'm going to talk about mission in a little bit, so I'm not going to focus on that so much here. But the magnanimous man, as I've said, awareness of own and others' dignity comes from God, inspired to do great things as a result. If we're in love with God, if we are aware that everything we have comes from him, we should want to do great things for him and for others. We should just want to. Now, we lose that, I think, and I think we get that confused with, it's a bit cliched, I get that. It's not quite as hard and fast as this. But we lose it in the society we live in. We confuse virtue and greatness with the idea of the millionaire over there. The Dragon's Den culture, the idea that they are a great success because they're rich. Now, there may be some truth to the idea of a great success in their own world, but actually, that's not enough. We need to do great things for God, not for money. Personal excellence is the ultimate aim of magnanimity. The end is not enough if it doesn't foster the development of virtue and character and personal excellence of all of those involved. Not just you, but everybody. Magnanimity ultimately is a virtue of service. The great things we achieve need to be for others. It needs to be a gift at some level to humanity. The magnanimous man creates an environment around him which is conducive to magnanimity. Who do you hang out with? What films do you watch? What books do you read? All of this. Okay. I think it was Mark again actually yesterday said don't hang out with. You didn't use the phrase negative people, but that's what I took from it. Don't ignore them as such, but don't hang out with them. Be around people who are in line with your mission. Be around people who are going to encourage you with it, who maybe they're ahead of you. Be around them. The magnanimous man doesn't compare themselves to anyone else because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what that person is doing. It doesn't matter what that person thinks about me. It has no impact on me as an individual whatsoever, unless I have decided that somehow maybe my dignity is dependent on how much I achieve, and that person seems to be doing a bit better than me. It's irrelevant. And I just want to reiterate, personal goals are never the end. They're a means to growth for everyone involved. And the magnanimous man is really clear about that. It's all about service. Humility. So a brief history of humility. The earliest kind of writings about it actually were within Confucianism, which is actually, if you read a little bit about it, it's really interesting. It's really very centred on others rather than self. Consistently valuing social good over individual desires. It's fascinating to read. I mean, there's obviously some errors, but it's really interesting. You then have Socrates, who writes, wisdom is above all the humility to know what we don't know. We then come on to Aristotle, who wasn't actually that keen on it. He kind of, he wasn't completely averse, but he kind of saw it as potentially problematic in terms of magnanimity, actually. And I think there was a misunderstanding there to some degree, but he talked about it being between the vices of arrogance and moral weakness. But where he was absolutely spot on was it must include accurate self-knowledge and a generous acknowledgement of others. He just wasn't so keen on what that might mean. And then Aquinas and consequent Christian thought has kind of brought that fruition in the light of Christ. So it's understood humility as a true relation with God and therefore an active need to serve others. And so we move on to this little snazzy table here, which talks about the different aspects of humility. And I'm just going to touch on each of them briefly because I want to get to service in a minute and some aspects of humility. But there is a real sense with humility that in order for it to be real, we need to know ourselves, first and foremost. Excuse me. I talk a lot about this in terms of mission and knowing ourselves and where we've got to, but if we don't understand that we have a need to perfect ourselves in order to serve others, if we don't understand the truth about our talents, we can't serve others. If I don't appreciate my talents, as I said, I'm not going to be able to bring others to greatness because I'm not going to know how I am most effective in doing so. But the point of all of that is that top one, that fraternal humility. It's to bring me into the service of God and into the service of everyone around me, acknowledging that is the point. That is the point. So a few of the aspects of humility again, self-knowledge, be mindful of our createdness. It's really difficult to keep in mind the fact that I'm a 1 in a trillion shot, for want of a better way of putting it. There's no reason why I should exist beyond God's love. There's no physical, psychological reason for me to be here. I don't need to be here and nobody would lose anything. I'd like to think my wife would have a worse life without me, but you know, I'm not going to ask her that. But there's no reason at all for me to be here. I am, and I hate to tell you this, but the same applies to all of you, other than love. And being mindful of that, it makes it basically impossible not to be humble, not to recognise that truth, and not to be grateful for it. Being mindful of your flaws. I'm not going to talk too much about this today, but one of the things that can be really useful is to do something called the temperaments test. If you want to chat to me about it afterwards, happy to, or get in touch. But it really, I found it an incredibly useful vehicle to recognise biologically where I'm likely to go if I'm under stress. What are the things I'm likely to do that are wrong? Because it just comes to me naturally to lash out or be impatient or whatever it might be. But also be mindful of those things you're not very good at and recognise it and don't pretend that you can do it if you can't. Acknowledgement of dignity, which I talked about under magnanimity, be aware of your talents, same thing. Humility, serve others and help people grow. This is the active part of humility. We recognise our littleness amongst God and the need to serve others as a result. But ultimately, humility is in its proper sense, is a habit of living in the truth. It's a really good story, actually, which I'll tell, which demonstrates this, I think. The truth of humility is not this sense of, oh, I'm ever so humble, sir. Flannery O'Connor is a Catholic author, I'm sure many of you have read. She was, many years ago, she was at this conference for writers of some description. And they're in the final session, and she gets asked the question, so can you tell us why you write? And I think, I'm utterly speculating here, I think the expected answer was probably something like, I just need to get it out of me. Or, I don't know, it's just self-expression. But her response was, she gave a little grin and she said, because I'm good at it. And that's the most humble thing she could have said, because it's true. Now, that doesn't mean go out all the time and constantly talk about what you're good at. But if you're asked, don't lie, don't pretend. That's not humble. It's the inversion of arrogance. It's this idea that I'm not allowed to be good at something because somehow that's going to look bad on me. Know what you're good at and don't be embarrassed by it is a truly humble position to take. So I'm not going to talk too much about 4 cardinal virtues, partly because actually there's loads out there. If you've not read Pieper, Joseph Pieper, on the cardinal, he's got a book called Cardinal Virtues. Do so. Brilliant. Couldn't recommend it highly enough. It's probably the best book I've ever read on the virtues. But just briefly, prudence, making right decisions. Make sure you know correct moral principle and then apply it in any given situation. It's just a brief anecdote. I've told a few of you this already, so apologies for repeating it. For a few years, stopped now for financial reasons at the university, but for a few years I was talking about virtuous leadership at St Mary's in Twickenham. And when talking about prudence and how to take decisions, I would always say I'd introduce the topic of abortion, which always causes a stir. And there's a stat in a book called Freakonomics which says that the best way to lower violent crime in America is to introduce abortion on demand. And so I'd introduce this stat and ask the question, should we do it? And it was always very interesting, actually, to look around the room and see a few of them go, yeah, definitely. A few just kind of utterly shocked, and a few kind of looking at me with a weird look and going, well, where's he going with this? But then I would also introduce a stat that the best way to completely eradicate certain demographics in America, by which meant certain ethnic minorities and the poor, in essence, was to introduce abortion on demand. And then ask the same question, should we do it? And the point of that was to introduce to them the idea that they need a lot more thought and evidence before they come to a conclusion based on a single stat. And it was incredibly imprudent to have a knee-jerk reaction to something. But at the same time, it also introduces the idea that maybe, just maybe, some of this stuff has a higher principle you need to take into account. And it is imprudent not to do so. Courage, running risks and staying the course. Courage often, and this is good and can be inspiring, it's often characterised as running, leaping out of the trenches into gunfire. And that is clearly brave. Don't get me wrong, I don't want to do it. But for the most part, courage is about staying the course. No, this is getting videoed, I can't say what I was about to say. But if you're in the workplace where certain things are getting pushed that are completely incompatible with your beliefs or your faith, courage is about not just going along with it. It's staying the course despite the brickbats that might come. I've taken a decision and nothing has changed, but nobody likes it, but I still think it's right. Courage is saying, well, okay, I'm going to go with it. The ability to endure is one which I would say is crucial to marriage. And I don't mean that in its negative sense. I don't mean that in a, oh my word, I've got to live my wife type sense. It's things happen in families, and it is a particularly masculine quality, I think, to be able to endure and to be the one who leads despite everything that might happen. I'm quite happy to talk about that more on a one-to-one basis. But we need to keep that in mind. Justice is essentially giving everyone their due. If everybody is in the image of God, then we need to make sure we are treating them right. the whole thing about justice versus mercy, etc., is an interesting discussion, but ultimately it comes down to, am I treating this person as if they in the image of God? And if not, why not? And self-mastery, Sam touched on this earlier as well, directing passions. I think society, this is probably the thing that society lacks most of today. This idea that I need an immediate hit. Everything must be immediate. Somebody yesterday talked about the fact that we will complain if a delivery is taken more than 24 hours. You know, just the little things like that. And then there's the more obvious ones around lust and anger, which I'm going to touch on in a minute, because anger gets a negative press, and I don't think it's entirely justified. But these things must be directed. We know what they look like when they're rightly ordered, and it's an act of the will to direct them. It takes effort and it takes self-control, but it's an absolutely fundamental part of who we are as men. So I just realised I didn't move a slide on, apologies. That's what I was talking about. So before moving on to mission, we practice it by practicing it. This last sentence here, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. Identify the bits in your life that you struggle with. Take an action to address it. When that's sorted, take the next action you need to get better. It's not a particularly complicated process, as difficult as it can be at times, but it is that consistent action. And at the risk of sounding like I'm trying to persuade you all to hire me as a coach, finding someone to be accountable to is really, really helpful here. I don't think I would have got to where I am today, and it's a low base I was starting from, believe me, but without numerous people holding me to account because I'd asked them to. And gatherings like this can be great, actually, not least for the practice of something akin to fraternal correction, because, again, it just helps us to get better, you know. I often... brotherly love, fraternal love within the Catholic Church should look like that. It should look like people correcting others at times because they need it to come back in the right direction. So practice. So discover your mission. If you don't know who this chap is a fascinating story. I'd highly recommend you go and find out about him. He was a poet. He lived a very hedonistic life. He eventually converted. He compared himself to Augustine, so in terms of hedonism and what have you. But he's fascinating. But he talks in really interesting terms, and he's worth reading. But there's one quote in particular that leaps out at me. There is a mystical meaning in many lies, but not everyone correctly understands this. It often comes to us in encrypted form, and we, failing to decipher it, despair over the meaninglessness of our life. The success of great lives is often due to the fact that the person managed to decipher the code that came down to him, understood, and learned how to proceed correctly. And there's a real sense in that of each individual having a particular mission. And that is, I think, where it differs slightly from vocation. Mission is not a vocation. A vocation is a call to live, think, feel and act in a particular way, and is always a call from God. You know, I live as a husband and a father, and I try to think in those terms. And most of you know, I think I'm a member of Opus Dei, and that I live in a particular way because of that. There's a vocation, it was a call from God. A mission isn't that. It's normally a result of human consideration, although it doesn't rule out divine mission. I've actually put Joan of Arc there, but I should have put St. Joseph. If we think about St. Joseph briefly here, he had a really clear mission from God. And this might I should have tested this in advance. But at one level, you can look at it, if his mission was the protector of God. You know, this little baby who God has come to us as, and St. Joseph was tasked with protecting him. That's an incredible mission. But usually it comes of human consideration, trying to work these things out. And the relationship between vocation and mission is one where vocation is a framework in which we carry out and discover our mission. And so what that really means is, if you have identified a mission which takes you away from your vocation, you've done it wrong. Because your vocation is above that. Mission is a way of living that out in a particular sense, and I'll get into some of that shortly. So what is a mission? It's a call to action. It's something that I am going to do, and I am going to do it all the time. Bear with me. It's something I will do repeatedly. Well, there's this apocryphal story about, and I think it's true, about John Paul II. One night, it was about 9 o'clock, and he was going to yet another meeting. I don't know who with. And his secretary at the time said to him, "Holy Father, you look exhausted. Let me handle this. There are others who can deal with it. Go and rest." And John Paul turned to him and said, "What right have I to be tired?" And I don't think what he was saying was that he couldn't be tired. I think what he was saying is that if there's something to do, I should do it. And that, I mean, it's a very simple example, but it's really interesting to me. The last few years, as I've started to understand this, I watch a lot less television. And the reason for that is I can't justify it to myself, because most of the time, occasionally it's all right. Most of the time, it's just me wanting to chill out, ignore what I should be doing, because I know there's stuff I could be doing that's productive and sensible and part of my mission, and I just want to take a break. But there's no need to take a break at that moment. And I certainly, if I want to take a break, should be doing something which is much more conducive to what my mission is. And it's also your own specific contribution to humanity. And I'll get into how you might identify that in a minute. In fact, I'll get into that now. I keep forgetting to change slides. I do apologise. Next time I start on a topic completely unrelated to the slide that's there, someone shout, because it's bound to happen again. So discovering your mission. This is the combination. I mean, there's probably lots of ways of doing it, and actually maybe you don't need to identify it, particularly if you're someone who has a sense of it already. But it's in essence, it's a combination of your story, and I'll talk about that. I've touched on temperament and your talent. So your story. This is not. It's really important to understand where you've come from. I think that's been touched on at various intervals, particularly by Mark and Sam over this weekend. But it's really important. It's not War and Peace. It doesn't need to be a biographical 500-page thriller. But it is identifying the people and the key events and the things which have made you who you are today. And when I say the key events, and I'll just highlight this, it doesn't necessarily mean the ones we automatically go to. One of the ones I did when I did this exercise was I was about 7 or 8, and I was in an assembly at school, and everybody was talking. Literally everybody, and the teacher leading the assembly suddenly just exploded, and she's gone, "Right, anyone who's talking, put your hand up." And for reasons I cannot to this day explain, my hand went like that. Well, yeah. Anyway, as a result of that, I got to leave assembly early, and I think I went to lunch early and a couple of other things. But it also meant that for the next, I don't know, certainly felt like 2 or 3 years, I got absolutely coated by numerous kids because of that thing, and I hated it. And the lesson I took from that was honesty is a bad idea. Don't be honest unless it really you can see how it serves you. And I lived with that unconsciously for the next 20 or so years. And for most of that, I was a congenital liar. And it's bluntly still, you should always question me when I tell you something. Because it's still something which instinctively is my first thought. How do I get out of this? How do I make this all right? How do I push away from whatever's going on? And that through the practice, I think, of virtue down the years and a habitual and deliberate decision not to be like that, I've got better. Not perfect, but better. My point about all of that is the events we need to identify these events which have impacted us like that. And it's not necessarily my wedding day. It's a wonderful day, don't get me wrong. And my marriage is clearly part of it. But the wedding day itself was just a day, really. You know, it was a wonderful celebration and da-di-da. But actually, it was what happened for the next 15 years, 14 years thus far. That's key. But identify those things. Temperament, as I said, it's our biological inclinations to particular ways. And discover your talent. You need to know what you're good at to know what your mission is. There's no point loving something if you can't do it very well. I spoke yesterday briefly in the questioning about wanting to be a football coach and what have you. I was all right. You know, I was okay. If I'd really pursued that, I'd probably be unemployed, bluntly. But it's not good enough to love something. You have to be good at it as well. You have to know what your talent is and marry that up with the things that have brought you to here in your temperament to identify your specific mission. And just in case you're wondering, I should probably tell you what mine is, I guess. So I have concluded, and it's something I've been working on for around 3 or 4 years, I've concluded that my mission is to transform society through virtue. That fits well with, I can do that at home with my family, I can do that at work, I can do it anywhere, really, at some level. And that's why I go around talking about this. But to give you a few examples, there's a few there. There's Mother Teresa. The one I want to focus on is Jerome Lejeune. And if you don't know his story, it's worth looking into it. He was a brilliant scientist, brilliant. Well, thank you. Brilliant. You know, he was top of his field. He was up for a Nobel Prize. But he was around in the 60s when abortion was first starting to get pushed. And he very, very clearly stated, we need to stop kidding ourselves that what we are doing is anything but killing human beings. I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember the exact phrase, but that was the essence of it. And he came out, that was at a UN conference, the United Nations were pretty good at pushing it. And he came out and said to his wife, I've just given up my Nobel Prize. And he got absolutely coated for years, but he was so committed to this mission, I want to uphold scientific truth and the larger moral truth that flows from it, that I wouldn't say he didn't care, but he cracked on, and he carried on. So I'll finish on this. This is a quote I had earlier, but it is wonderful. It got mentioned yesterday. The world offers you comfort, but you were not made for comfort. You were made for greatness. What that looks like for you will differ to what it looks like for me, to what it looks like for someone else. But don't allow yourself, and I mean it, I'm going to get slightly American-y guru-ish now, but don't allow yourself to settle for a sort of slightly mediocre life. And by that, I mean, be really clear. Seek virtue. Practice it. Seek what it is that you are uniquely put here on this earth to do. Find out what that is. You know, speak to people. What do they think you're good at? Because it's probably going to differ from what you think. I was amazed when people said what you're really good at is working with people. I had no idea. Go out and seek it. Know what your mission is. Make sure that you commit to it. Because it is, I think, going back to that first slide I had up, it's key. Without that, I don't see a way forward. Thank you.